Hey everyone, Pastor Bob Kaylor here with your Midweek Bible Break. As we've been moving through this series in Genesis, one of the things you might notice is that there are a lot of different kinds of marital arrangements popping up here as we move through the text. From Abraham having the servant girl Hagar, and then Sarah, his own wife, to Jacob, who we're going to see is going to have multiple wives and sons through this process. How does this square with what God says back in Genesis 1 about the intention of marriage? It's an important question, and one I wanted to dive into just for a bit here in this video, because there are a lot of things that we'll look at here that seem very out of character for what God intends, and yet they're important to moving the story along. So we need to have some categories for them and put them in perspective. Now, this particular video is a little bit PG-13, so if you're watching this with your kids, you may want to have to think about explaining some stuff to them. Just think about the fact that we're talking about some more mature subjects as we go through this part of the Bible. But again, it's all in the Bible, so we want to make sure that we give it its due attention. Well, let's go back to the very beginning and remember where things started with the beginning of creation. In Genesis chapter 1, God creates humanity, male and female, in his image. They're designed to be together for fruitfulness, multiplication, and stewardship. Genesis 2, we get a further understanding of that image of God, that one flesh union, about leaving and cleaving. The man leaves his father and mother, unusual in the ancient world because most of the time it was the woman who did the leaving. But the idea in that phrasing is to say that now this is going to be the primary relationship, a monogamous, lifelong relationship between a man and a woman designed to produce children, a family unit that fulfills God's purposes in creation. The family is going to reflect, as we Christians would see it, reflect the Trinity. This bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. That's what's meant by the term one flesh. This term is kind of the John 3:16 of marriage. If you think about John 3:16 being foundational to our understanding of the gospel, this is foundational to our understanding of marriage itself. It's a shorthand for the union of these same difference. Both human beings, but designed to fit together. Their differences designed to complement one another. Genesis 2:24, then, when we talk about this one flesh union, is not just talking about Adam and Eve, but about the basic design for marriage. That sexual union is designed for bonding and for producing offspring. What does Adam say when he sees Eve? This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And now we're producing bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. That's what the one flesh union is about. It's about kinship, about forming a new family together to take God's creative purposes forward. And so the Bible ultimately protects this one flesh union as sacred and exclusive. Again, one man, one woman, designed for a lifelong partnership to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. But then we get to Genesis 3. And what happens when sex becomes separated from its original context? Sin, of course, enters the picture here in Genesis 3. We've talked a lot about that as a failure to reflect God's image and God's purpose. In Genesis 1 and 2, we see God creating Adam and Eve, male and female. They're naked and unashamed. They're designed for intimacy with God and with each other. And yet, after doing what God told them not to do in Genesis 3, we find them hiding. We find them comparing themselves to one another. We find that shame enters the picture. Sexuality, which was designed to be within this context of marriage, within this context of one flesh union, now becomes a source of shame. And it's because of idolatry, because we place self at the center. And our desires now begin to rule over us, and our orientations become disoriented. And all of us experience that to some degree or another in our human relationships. The fall permeates all of that. And so when we talk about sex, when we talk about the sexual revolution and things like that, we see it as a natural outcome of what's happened in Genesis 3. It wasn't how we were designed, but it's how things are. And the question is, what will we do with that? What are the effects of the fall? Well, sex out of its proper context begins to be destructive. It begins to work backwards. It creates hierarchy, not mutuality. It creates the sense of people being used for sexual pleasure rather than having this mutual one flesh union. Fruitfulness and multiplication occurs through pain. And indeed, many people divorce sexuality even from that, the idea that sex and procreation don't have to go together. It's a disordering of desire, as Paul says in Romans 1. It's a way of worshiping the creature rather than the creator. It's taking something God meant to serve us and be part of our relationship and making it the primary focus of our being. That's a very Freudian way of thinking. There's a lot we could say about that when it comes to living on the other side, not only of Genesis 3, but also of the sexual revolution. Again, this is something that's permeating all of humanity. And it began to do that early on. Even by Genesis 4, we see Lamech, for example, one of the offspring of Adam, getting down to grandsons and great-grandsons. He's the first to engage in polygamy. He marries 2 women. Genesis 6, we have the sexual congress of human women with the sons of God producing the Nephilim, these early superheroes, clearly crossing a boundary that God had set between the divine and human. We get the strange story of Lot and his daughters in Genesis 19. As Lot and his family are fleeing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's wife turns back. She's not supposed to look back. She turns into a pillar of salt. Lot and his 2 daughters escape to a cave. They think that the world is coming to an end, these daughters, and so they get their father drunk and decide to sleep with him so that they can produce offspring through him. These offspring will ultimately be nations that will be opposed to Israel. But it's an odd story that indicates just how out of whack things have become. Of course, the whole Sodom and Gomorrah story itself is about that too. It's a departure from God's design that leads to confusion and conflict and things beginning to spiral out of control. We get to the patriarchal period, though, by the time we get to Genesis 12, and we see that the family unit's starting to take shape, but it's not exactly in the way that God intended. We see the practice of polygamy with an N, one patriarch married to or sexually active with more than one woman. Polygamy, on the other hand, is marrying more than one woman. So there's a question here about whether these relationships are marriages or how does that work. That's one of the things we're going to talk about here in this particular video. What does it mean to have these multiple wives in the patriarchal period? But the point was to produce male heirs, to populate the family compound. Everything, again, was centered around the patriarch and that household. That was the center. It wasn't a nation state or anything like that. The family was the center. The father's house is critical. And you'll notice throughout the Bible, the Father's house becomes a really important image. Jesus is going to use that image himself. But how is that house populated? Well, in this patriarchal period, it's being populated by multiple people. The idea being to produce enough people to run the household, to be workers in this pastoral agricultural culture. We see the outcome of this in the stories we've been reading so far. We read about Sarai, who's barren and old, and Abraham's very old. And so God promises that they're going to have a son, but Sarah wants to jumpstart that process. And so she decides to give Abram her servant girl, Hagar, as a way of producing a male heir to continue the family. Of course, this isn't what God intended. And God will tell them that Ishmael, the son, is not going to be the son of promise. They are going to have a biological son, Isaac, who's going to carry that promise forward. But we see that practice already emerging here, that now Abraham is involved with 2 different women. And what takes place? There's a rivalry between the sons. There's a rivalry between the women. And things begin to go sideways. We get to the Jacob story, which we started this past week. And as we're going to see in this week's sermon and down the road, Jacob is going to go back to Haran as he flees from Esau. He's going to wind up marrying sisters who are his first cousins. And there's a whole story behind that I don't have time to get into in this video. Stay tuned for Sunday. We'll talk about that some. But he's going to produce children not only through these two sisters, but also through their maids, their servants, slaves, if you will, Zilpah and Bilhah. In fact, they are going to produce the bulk of these sons for Jacob. The 12 sons of Israel come from 4 different women, all of whom are in relationship with each other, all of whom are related to Jacob as wives or as secondary wives. And that brings us to the status of concubine. That's a word you see used a lot in the Old Testament. A concubine is a wife of lower status. So if you have the primary wives, in Jacob's case, you have Leah and Rachel. Of course, Leah gets slipped in there without Jacob's knowledge. He intended to marry Rachel. He winds up marrying both of them because of his uncle's scheming. Again, another story we'll get into. But in some cases, this involves then the elevation of these servant or slave girls, just like Hagar, Bilhah, and Zilpah are elevated to the status of concubine or secondary wife. And their primary purpose was to produce an heir if the primary wife could not. So we see these women who are barren, Leah and Rachel, again, repeating the pattern that we've seen already here in Genesis. And so they jumpstart the process. Let's have male heirs through these secondary wives. They also fulfill the patriarch's sexual needs. Concubinage then was practiced, and particularly among the wealthy, particularly among those of the royal classes. And it did indeed provide some protection for these women because they're bearing heirs for the patriarch. It does give them a chance at survival and makes them connected to a family, even if they're not fully connected. And so they have a place to be. They're part of the family, rather than the only recourse for women who were not connected to a family was often prostitution in order to make a living. Polygamy seems to have been something practiced by kings, mostly rather than by common people. We see it here in the patriarchal narratives, but by the time we get to later in the Old Testament, the only ones who are really having multiple wives are those in some royal kind of position, like David, like Solomon. But these marriages were also ways of sealing alliances with other states. So if you wanted to make an alliance, you didn't necessarily just send an emissary over there. You would marry the daughter of that particular king as a way of sealing that relationship. And most famously, Solomon is going to have 700 wives and 300 concubines. That seems impossible to us to think about even the logistics of all of that, but God warns against it. He warns against it in Deuteronomy 17. He says, these kings should not have too many wives. They should not have too much gold. They should not have too many horses for chariots. Another way of putting that is that they should avoid gold, guns, and girls because it's going to turn their hearts away. And that's exactly what happens with Solomon. All of these wives who come from these pagan nations begin to turn his attention away from God and toward pagan practices. It's not a good thing. There's another practice we see here in Genesis called levirate marriage. This was part of Israel's history. We even see glimpses of this in the New Testament. Jesus is asked about this by the Sadducees at one point in a question about the resurrection. The idea was that if a husband dies, it was the responsibility of one of his brothers to marry the widow and to produce heirs for the family, so that this widow would have some protection. She would be part of the family. She would have children, hopefully sons, who would then take care of her in her old age. It was a way of guaranteeing security for the woman and making sure the inheritance got passed to the next generation. We see examples of this in the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38, which is another one of those really bizarre stories that kind of pops up here in the Genesis narrative. Tamar marries into the family of Judah, who is one of the sons of Jacob, and her husband dies. The idea was that now she's supposed to marry the next brother, and the one brother refuses. The next brother goes into her, but he spills his seed on the ground. That's Onan. We often hear that text referred to as a polemic against masturbation. Told you this was PG-13. But really, the point of that story is that Onan refuses to do the duty of the brother and allow Tamar to have this heir that she's supposed to have to take care of her. And so she resorts to tricking Judah into sleeping with her, essentially, by dressing up as a prostitute, and that produces the heir. It's a bizarre story, but it's one that's there in the Bible, and we need to look at it. The story of Ruth and Naomi is another one of these stories. Remember that both Ruth and her sister Mary, the sons of Naomi, both of those sons die. Now, how is the family going to go forward? Naomi says, I can't have other children. You can't wait for them to grow up. Who is going to help save that family? Well, that's where the great love story of Ruth and Boaz comes into play. We looked at that a couple of Advents ago, Advent 2023. So you might want to go back through our video archive and look at those if you want to dive into that story a little more deeply. But if women were outside of this process, they were often left to try to fend for themselves, and often that meant prostitution. Prostitution was common in the ancient world. It was also part of temple cults of pagan religions. Now, scholars debate this, but in many pagan rituals, prostitutes were used, sexual acts were done in order to make the gods do what you wanted them to do in the spirit world. And when Tamar wants to get with Judah, she disguises herself as a temple prostitute, according to Genesis 38, and he sleeps with her. There's a lot of nefarious stuff going on here. This is not God's creational intent, but this is how things are spinning out on the other side of Genesis 3. So how are we to understand these texts? Well, again, the Bible doesn't explicitly condemn these actions. We wish that it did, but then again, it doesn't really have to, because when we look at them, we see that they don't work out. Things get worse when these things happen. Jacob's going to marry sisters. They're going to have a rivalry with each other. There's a rivalry within that whole family. We see it in the Joseph story, which we're going to focus on during Lent. We see the conflict between Hagar and Sarah, between Isaac and Ishmael. It just never works out. This is not what God intended. God's original intent does not change. Human beings are trying to get around it and trying to be pragmatic in how they're doing things, but this isn't how God intended things to work, and that's why things begin to go sideways. And yet, God continues to work with these human beings despite the distortion, despite the things that are going wrong, in order to bring his covenant purposes to bear. But the point is, the Bible from the very beginning is always trying to get us back to what God intended from the beginning. Jesus talks about this himself. Matthew 19, Mark 10, he's asked a question about divorce. And what does Jesus do? He immediately dials back to Genesis 1 and 2. They say to him, Moses allowed us to give a wife a certificate of divorce and dismiss her. And Jesus says, Moses gave you that because of the hardness of your hearts. It was not so from the beginning. God's original intent was for one man and one woman to be in lifelong, mutual, one flesh connection with one another, producing children, caring for one another, making God's creational purposes come to reality. It was not so from the beginning. So Jesus is not very sexually progressive. In fact, he's sexually regressive. He's taking us back to the very beginning. A lot of people say Jesus didn't say much about this. Well, this is pretty clear. He's taking us back to the beginning. What does God intend? He reaffirms God's creational intent for sex within the context of marriage. And his warning against lust is another way of reinforcing that. We talked about this past Sunday. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Because this distorted desire is the gateway to all kinds of sexual brokenness. We see that happening in Genesis. We see it happening in our own culture. The sexual revolution has taken this and expanded it exponentially. But the New Testament is univocal in its view, along with the Old Testament, that God's intent for us, The best way for us to live, the way we were designed to live, was in this covenant of marriage, this one flesh union that God created from the beginning. And so we as Christians then take this as our historical Christian view of marriage, that marriage is a one flesh, lifelong union between a man and a woman who share in the image and purpose of God. That marriage and family are public and social institutions that reflect the character and nature of the Trinity and the kingdom of God on earth. Remember, as God is unity and community, that's what marriage is designed. It's a fellowship of difference. We're like in so many ways, but we're different. We're designed to fit together. Marriage and celibate singleness, though, are equally valid means of living out the mission of the kingdom of God. Marriage isn't the only way we do that. Remember that Jesus and Paul likely not married, therefore no one would say they didn't live a complete human life. They have a purpose. But marriage points beyond itself. It's designed for this world. As Jesus says in his response to the Sadducees, don't you know that in the kingdom, in the resurrection, people are neither married nor given in marriage because the fulfillment of God's creation has taken place. Marriage right now points beyond itself as a representation of the relationship between God and his people, between Christ and his church. And so marriage is a placeholder for the eschatological union with Christ that will take place at the resurrection. It's pointing to something beyond itself. God intends it for us for good in the moment, in this time, so that when the fullness of the kingdom of God comes, we will see all things come together, and that creational mandate that God gave us from the beginning will be fulfilled. In some ways, this is all about getting back to the garden. If we want to understand marriage, we begin and end with Genesis 1 and 2. These are important questions. There's so much more that can be said about this. I've done whole courses on sexuality in the Bible and what it means for us. And of course, it's a controversial topic to talk about today, but we talk about it from a Christian and biblical perspective. I think if we begin there, it shapes the way we think about these conversations as we have them all the time. So I hope that you will take a look at some of these texts and understand them within this larger context of the whole Bible. This Sunday, we're going to be diving deeper into the Jacob story, looking at his dream, what we might call his theophany, his call of God to be the next one to carry forth the covenant. I hope you'll join me and join us at Aldersgate Church. You can find us online, aldersgateyork.com. You can find our YouTube page for all these videos, for our podcast, for so many other pieces of material that will help you as you study through the book of Genesis. It's great to be with you. Have a great week, and we'll see you on Sunday.